it's Sam, and I'm making another video here where I'm going to be discussing how those qualities that I generally discussed in Brihat Parashara sort of plays out tangibly into what we want in our life, and how we have principles, techniques, and outcomes. So what I mean to say is that there are these principles. Like I said, gravity is a principle, and then we have a technique, which is doing something with gravity, or where we need to consider gravity, because there's no way to get away from the principles, and for some outcome. So let's say that we have an outcome that we want. We tend to focus on outcomes and techniques, and forget that there are principles behind it. This is just even in our everyday life. Let's say I have the outcome that I want to go to New York tomorrow. Okay? I live in San Francisco, so if I want to go to New York, let's say in 2 days. I want to go to New York in 2 days. There are principles at play that I need to first deal with. First of all, there's distance. It's a principle. I can't overcome distance. I can't just wipe it off the map and say, well, I'm going to get to New York, but the fact that it's that far away doesn't really matter. Well, you can't say that. Principles matter. We need to cover a long distance, and the only way that I can cover it of my own accord is through my legs, my feet. I cannot get to New York by myself. Right? So, what technique can I employ to get that outcome? We do this all the time, by the way. So, we have to find some kind of device, if it exists, that allows me to get to New York in a couple days. Now, of course, in this modern world, we can do that. 100 years ago, you couldn't get to New York from San Francisco in 2 days. Now we can get there in a few hours, because of these things called airplanes. But the airplane must take into account everything that I just said, because when we look at the principle of distance, then that means I can't cover that distance myself. So I need to also account for things like gravity, speed, acceleration, fatigue, time, because obviously I'm saying that it's 2 days. But I can't, so these are the reasons that I can't achieve this outcome, and these are the things that must be taken into account with any technique. So any technique that's going to get me from New York to San Francisco in 2 days is going to have to account for all of these principles. Okay, if I say I want to get to New York in 3 weeks, there's a whole other set of techniques that could maybe get me there. If I say I want to get there in 3 years, I might just walk, and I'd be there in 3 years. So these are the things that we need to look at. It's also very related to astrology, because astrology, we have an outcome. The outcome is simple. What's going to happen? What's the answer? Why is this happening? And we have to account, and so we need a technique to find it, and those techniques are based on principles. Principles that are metaphysical principles, not necessarily physical ones. They're just as real. So again, when we have the solution of an airplane, the technique to get that outcome is get my body to the airport and get on an airplane. Again, that's also not so easy, because I live 25 miles from the airport. If I want to get there, I have to get into another vehicle to get me to the airport, unless I want to leave like right now and run a marathon to get there, or, right? So this means I'm going to have to account for gravity. Gravity is a universal principle that I can't change. Acceleration, I need some kind of device, and it has to be a mechanical device at this point, not an organic device like a horse. A horse could get me to the airport. It's not going to get me to New York. And plus, even if I use a horse, then I also need to feed the horse. I need to have water for the horse. Just like with the airplane brings up a whole bunch of other principles, like we need fuel. The airplane operates in accordance with those principles: gravity, acceleration, deceleration, liftoff, descent. All those things create the outcome. So how does this relate to astrology? Well, one of the things that happens, again, like I said, is we focus on techniques and outcomes as astrology students. All the time it's like, how do you see career in the chart? How do you see my spouse in the chart? How do you see this? How do you see that? I get it, right? How do you see it? What's the technique for looking at it? So someone says, look at the 10th Lord. Look in the Dasamsha chart. Look at the 10th house. That's usually what they say. People overlook the Lord usually most of the time. They don't say the Lord, they say the house. Maybe the 10th house Lord. Look at Saturn, look at the sun. Again, that's a technique. Or that's something, that's the beginning of a technique. But again, up from that is principle. If I were to tell you to look at the 10th Lord and you don't know what you're looking for or what you're looking at, you're not going to know. So these principles are upstream from the techniques. And the principles are the things that Parashara talks about that's so important. That's why, as I said, when you understand the level of principle, techniques are just organizing principles. Once you understand the principle of gravity and fuel and whatnot, then you know what you need to make in order to traverse that distance. Now maybe you don't have the technology to make it yet. Like it took a while for us to know how to make an airplane. Leonardo da Vinci tried to do it. They didn't have the technology. They didn't have fuel. So now we got fossil fuel. They tried with steam, couldn't do with steam. We finally started to get an internal combustion engine. This has enough power to move the thing fast enough to get it to take off. If we design the wing the proper way so that it's going to lift, then we can do it. The same things happen in astrology when you get the principles. Now I'm going to talk about how things show different outcomes. And one of the things that gets really mixed up with principles, which is where people get confused, is they don't understand how to delineate these principles, and they're incredibly important. So, one of the main things to understand is there's a total difference between understanding what's going to happen, when it's going to happen, and why or what's the quality of the thing that happens. So one of the things I point out all the time to my students when we start to untangle this big thing is there's actually 4 possibilities in getting things. Okay? There's getting what we want and enjoying it. There's getting what we want and not enjoying it, or not being able to keep it. Then there's not getting what we want and enjoying it, and not getting what we want and not enjoying it. So you see these things play out. This is a simple way to look at it, but it delineates a lot of confusion because we don't understand Indian Vedic principles, like I said a couple videos ago, we can get really lost and confused about even what we want or why we want it, or why not getting something could be actually beneficial, and why getting something is not necessarily for our own good. This is where principles like the planets as house rulers become so important. Very important. And again, once you study that chapter in Brihat Parashara and you compare it to the way the planets as house rulers are talked about in other texts, you realize that Parashara is talking about Vedic principles, universal principles, where Dharma is key and favored. Because you can get the relationship, and if it's given by a planet that rules something that's cruel and difficult, then it's going to create a cruel, difficult relationship that creates more attachment. You can get the relationship from a planet, or let's say you cannot get a relationship from a planet that's very powerful and brings a lot of wisdom. And you'll be just fine with not getting that thing. Because in not getting it, you're being shown something that's true and real. These are the things that make an astrologer a great counselor. Because people come to astrologers confused. They want something, but many times they don't even know why they want it. They're just programmed. The karma arises, which is the when part. When I look at someone's chart, I see what's arising in their consciousness, because now's the time that this is happening. And then I look at the nature of the planet to see, is this something that's arising that's going to actually be leading them toward what they truly want and their highest self, or is it leading them away from it with a lot of illusion and attachment? You think they're the same thing? They're completely opposite. So when we look for a technique to try to find an outcome, we need to question all of that. The outcome of how do you see the nature of the spouse, or when it's going to happen, or if a client asked you, am I going to get this relationship that I want? If you don't learn things that are subtle like that, and you're trying to help the person get that outcome they want, you're going to be helping that person get something that is going to be destructive, let's say. That doesn't mean you're playing God with the person. It means that you can see the karma, the real nature of the karma that's unfolding so many times. And when it happens with me, because I understand the principles in Parashara, and I understand, and I know the techniques that get the outcomes as well. I can tell that when this planet, this 7th house ruler, is forming a Raja Yoga with the 10th Lord, let's say, then they might get involved with someone who is in a position of authority. Okay? Now, whatever the nature is of the conjunction, where it is, what the planets are, the relationship, all of that shows if it's going to be something that's helpful or beneficial. I don't make the decision for them, and I'm not a mind reader in that regard. I mean, I'm a mind reader because I can see what it is, but this is what you counsel the person on. You say, your relationships are like this, and you start telling them, talking with them about the nature of their relationships and the attachments they have and the difficulties they've experienced, and that they're about to experience this thing again, and that this desire for this thing that they want is actually another manifestation of this thing that has not led them where they want to go before, as an example. And you unfold that for them. So principles have to do with untangling these subtleties. They have to do with things like the gunas, the elements, the houses the planets rule, where the planets come together and form the Raja Yogas, which planetary cycles are running at that time, how these things look in the harmonic charts. These are all principles that show different things. And they delineate into different techniques. So, for instance, whether the planet gives or not gives has nothing to do with the nature of what it gives. So, for instance, a planet that is, let's say, going to lead the person, to a higher evolution and a higher enlightenment around whatever, isn't necessarily going to produce positive results. Let's use the example of an exalted planet, because this is something that people focus on a lot. If a planet is exalted, for instance, it has no bearing on whether or not it's going to produce and give that person what the person is truly looking for. Okay? If you get an exalted planet that is what's called a functional malefic, or that rules a difficult house, let's say Venus for Sagittarius, for example. It's the 6th and 11th house ruler, the ruler of 2 cruel houses. So if it's exalted, it will be the 4th house. It's going to make that thing really powerful in the person's life. But you're making something powerful that's going to give results that are stressful, because of what it rules. These are different principles. And if you get a Raja Yoga with that planet, which actually would be hard for Venus because it doesn't rule an angle or a trinal house, let's say that it's Leo, because it rules the 10th house. A Raja Yoga, let's say with Venus for Leo, always has a quality of difficulty, because it's a cruel planet. It could produce the thing and produce the stress and the problem with it. Always. They're different scenarios, and in producing the difficulty, it's going to bring awareness. It's going to bring awareness because of the dignity. So the dignities of the planets, their dignities show the level of intelligence. It's what's called a Avashta, the Jagrat Avashta. shows the base level of intelligence. Exalted is Jagrat, it's awake. That just shows its level of awareness. It has nothing to do with what it produces, nothing. It can produce the worst thing, it can destroy your life in order to show you the truth. In fact, this is why this stuff happens. Why do you think it happens that people will say, that's the worst thing that was a terrible time and the best thing that ever happened to me? Well, this is how you see that stuff. So understanding the principles that intelligence and truth has nothing to do with results, ultimately. Like I said when I started about results, you can get what you want and actually want and appreciate it. You can get what you want and not appreciate it. Or you can not get what you want and be fine, or not get what you want and be suffering. As an example, these are all different things. So results come from yogas, which means when planets join, and they're produced by what planets rule at specific times. Timing has to do with dashas and what the planets rule, not where they are. The planet in the 10th house is going to have a 10th house quality, but whatever it rules in its dasha cycle is going to show the theme, the main theme. So rulerships show results, and they show results based on yogas and associations with other planets and where they are, but it's always what the planets rule that show the result, and what they're joined through yogas, and the level of awareness, intelligence, wisdom that unfolds has to do with those things. It's not just the Jagrata Vashta, but that's a big one. There are other ways also, but that's the main way to qualify how much awareness and intelligence is coming from a planet. And you need to seek out the ones that give fulfillment are related to Dharma. They're the Dharma lords. That's why they're called Dharma lords. And they rule other houses too. So you'll see that the Dharma and the wisdom comes from in this way. And just a quick aside, Dharma and moksha, which means letting go, and truth are mixed with the masculine signs, which means masculine signs, the Dharma and the moksha houses are the same planet, because the Dharma lords also rule a moksha house. And for the feminine signs, which are the earth and water signs, Dharma and Artha are mixed. So Artha, which is wealth, value, respect, appreciation, is mixed with Dharma for the feminine signs, as an example. So these principles of Dharma, Artha, Kama, Moksha, again, it's a principle that's pervasive around consciousness, awareness, results, timing. If you don't understand it, or if you just, oh yeah, I've heard of that, and you're like on to the next complicated part of a technique that's disconnected from a universal principle, you're not going to get that. And that is everything. I'm telling you, it's everything, because it's the person's motivation. It's not just how they're feeling in it, but what's motivating them toward that thing. And if they get it, what's it going to mean? And what is the why behind the what? I want this, I'm doing this, my life is in this situation. How do I make it better? Okay, well, first you need to see and know how they got there. Because when people come for readings, they don't know. And they will say things, if you start explaining the truth to them and you don't know it very well, you'll get knocked off base really quick when you don't know this stuff. And again, I hear this all the time. Astrologers say it. Well, I read the chart, and as soon as the client says something that's not in the chart, I listen to the client, not the chart. This is absurd. It's because the person doesn't know what they're talking about. It's like going to a doctor. You know, there are people that say, well, there's some things that just aren't shown in the chart. It's like going to a doctor, or let's say going to a dentist, and he looks and he does your x-rays and he sees you have a cavity, and you're like, I don't have a cavity, I feel fine. He's like, oh, all right, sorry then. It's the same thing. People come to an astrologer and they're confused, they don't know. So you know when you're operating on the level of principles, these universal principles, that clearly distinguish between what the person wants, why they want it, what shows the level of intelligence, what shows what's going to actually happen. And I'll wind up saying things like, you want this thing right now because of this part of you, which we've already talked about, and I can see that you're going to get it, and that you're going to do this. And then at this point, I think you're going to start realizing that it's not the way it was supposed to be. It's not what you thought it would be, and you'll start to get some disappointment, and maybe this will happen. Or you can avoid that whole kind of thing, but I don't think you're going to do it. And again, I don't portray this as that they're making a mistake, but I let them know these are the choices. Because what winds up happening is it's actually really a catalyst often in those times for the person to be introspective and not make that same action again. By the way, action means karma. Not do that same karma again and have the same disappointment come in order to teach them. We have this thing called presence, which can step in the middle and say, I'm not going to follow this impulse at this time, and I'm going to sit with this thing and learn the lesson, because that potential is also there in those same moments. And I let them know that these are the moments. This is what the higher point is. And you can make that choice now. If you don't make that choice, then you're going to be in this relationship and it's going to do this kind of thing. And I think by this time you'll start to feel that, so just be aware of it and da 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 da. And as an astrologer, you need to know this, because the client will not often. They'll be confused. They don't know. This is how you can help them. So again, we focus on outcomes. What do I want? And as an astrology student or astrologer, you're like, here's how you can see that. So, okay, you're right. I see. You're going to have this relationship, and yeah, you're going to have it. And focus on the compatibility and not even looking at the real thing that's unfolding in the person. Happens all the time, because we, instead of look at what's really going on, we try to help the person get what they want, and not even shed light on what's really happening. And maybe your approach to astrology is to help people get what they want and fulfill your desires. That's not what astrology is for. It's okay if you want to use it that way, and it's to shed light. As I said at the beginning of these videos, it's about shedding light, explaining to the person what's happening in them, why, and what's the highest potential within them. And believe me, they'll understand it and they'll appreciate it. They'll appreciate that you can dignify that part of them. So again, these things come from studying the deep, powerful principles of Parashara. And again, like I said before, I've taken about 15 or 20 of these deep frameworks and gone deeply into them. Rather than digging these little holes everywhere, finding, oh, this thing, that thing, this thing, that thing, this thing, that thing, this thing, that thing, I just roll the way down to the bottom of the depth. And it's the same depth that you find in yoga, Ayurveda, and all the other ones. The point of the technique is to get the right answer. The point of the technique is to get the right answer. It's to get where you want to go. Not just gather a lot of details about how to maybe do it. It's to get on the plane and arrive in New York. It's to help the person, it's to land that thing that's happening in them. And so the only way we can do that is to first understand all those principles, then find the techniques that bring them together so we can see, this is why this is happening now, and then the outcome that they're focused on or that we're focused on has more wisdom and light in it. So I hope this was helpful.